Welcome to UW Now Live. Tonight, we're unpacking the changing world order and its impact on global power dynamics. Our guests are UW-Madison experts in foreign policy from the Department of Political Science. Yoshiko Herrera is a professor of political science and former director of the Center for Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia at UW-Madison. She has been a frequent guest on UW Now Live regarding the war between Russia and Ukraine. John Peavyhouse is the Mary Herbin Rubenstein Professor of Political Science and Public Policy and an expert in international relations and American foreign policy. The conversation will be moderated by your host, Mike Knetter.
Good evening, and thanks for joining us tonight. We like to market this show as covering timely and important topics, and here we are on the 4th anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and we'll run our program right up into the State of the Union address tonight by President Trump. So I'd say we're pretty timely, and I think our issues tonight are really important. We're going to try to step back from the daily headlines to ask what's really changing in the global order and what's just noise or rhetoric. And we're going to focus on a few major pressure points geopolitically in our opening segment. In particular, Ukraine, NATO, and Europe, the military buildup that's going on in the Middle East and its connection to Iran, Israel, and the war in Gaza, and the upheaval in global trade. And we've got two frequent and excellent guests with us tonight on this program who are going to share their insights on these geopolitical issues and much more. Some of the questions you might expect us to cover in either the presentations or the Q&A include, what is the current U.S. national security strategy, and how has that changed under the Trump administration? Our recent statements, for example, by Secretary Rubio at the Munich Security Conference, or actions such as the Middle East buildup, consistent with the new national security strategy? And what are the implications for U.S. support of NATO and Ukraine? And then beyond the U.S., how are these shifts in alliances and trade policy reshaping relationships between other countries, and where might new alliances or tensions be forming without America at the center? And of course, we'll ask your questions too, so please put them in the chat this evening. And I think we'll begin our program tonight with Yoshiko Herrera. She is, as introduced earlier, a professor of political science. She came onto this program for the first time. It was not quite 4 years ago, because I think it was a week after the Russian invasion. And I still remember her comments at the time that President Putin had made a massive strategic blunder with his attempt to invade Ukraine. And I wasn't sure that would prove accurate, but it sure looks that way today. But some of his objectives of dividing the West may be getting a little bit more traction with some of the changes in policy that we've seen over the last year. So I look forward to hearing your comments tonight, Professor Herrera. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to talk a little bit about the ongoing Russian war in Ukraine. Today, as many people know, is the 4th anniversary of the war. So now we're starting the 5th year of the war. But I want to talk about what's happened in the last year in the war, and also how the ongoing war in Ukraine is affecting transatlantic relations and the role of Russia in those relations. So I want to start with just a very basic map of the battlefield. On the far left, you can see the battlefield as it looked about a month into the war. So March 31st, 2022. That's after Russia launched an attack from the south, from the north, and from the east. And they captured a significant amount of Ukrainian territory. But by about October, November 2022, Ukraine had pushed them back. And if you look at the middle map, the blue areas are the areas that Ukraine had reconquered mostly by the fall of 2022. That middle map is actually a map from just a year ago, yesterday, from February 23rd, 2025. And the map on the right is a map just from yesterday of this year. And why I put those up there is I want to show you and our viewers that the war and the front line have really not changed very much in terms of territory in the last year. And in fact, you could go back to November 2022 and you see that the front line has been very stable overall. What has changed in 2025, as this graph shows, however, is that Russia, in addition to attempting, not very successfully, to capture Ukrainian territory, Russia has massively ramped up its use of missiles and drones or uncrewed aerial vehicles across Ukraine. And you can see that those tall blue lines are mostly starting in 2024, but then really they go up in 2025. And that's right in the midst of the ramping up also of peace negotiations. So you can see this is like problem number one, is that as peace negotiations have got started in 2025, Russia also massively increased the number of missile and drone strikes across the country, not just at the front lines. These are on civilian buildings, infrastructure, etc. And this is a graphic of Russian war casualties from The Economist today and a couple other sites. A lot of news agencies are looking at the last 4 years of the war and how costly it's been. And CSIS, actually a think tank, put out a figure of 1.2 million Russian casualties in the last 4 years of the war. That's dead, missing, wounded, and taken prisoner. And that graph on the left shows The Economist has divided out casualties and deaths. And the thing I want to point your attention to is if you look to the left where it says 2022, that 3/4 of the way through 2022 is where the Ukrainians pushed the Russians back. And that's been very stably where the front lines have been since then. So all those casualties that you see from 2022 on are all deaths and casualties in the context of a front line that has not moved very much at all. If you look on the upper right, you can see the monthly average of Russian casualties, which is over 26,000 men, a high point of 48,000. And the lower right graphic just shows last December, so December 2025. And what's on the left are the total casualties for 10 years of the Soviet Union fighting in Afghanistan, 38,000 casualties over 10 years. And Russia lost 35,000, that is including dead, missing, wounded, and taken prisoner just in 1 month in December. And what's important to note here is that Russia is now approaching a point where it's bringing in around 30-ish thousand new recruits every month, but it's losing a similar number in casualties each month. And so they're getting to a point where they're not even able to recover the monthly losses. So another way to look at this would be to look at the overall percentage of territory that Russia has gained over the last 4 years. And you can see on this graph on the left that there was initial gains in early 2022, then the Ukrainians pushed them back. And the amount of territory has been around 20% for much of the last 4 years. So by this metric, if you look at the territorial gains and you compare it to other wars, including some famous battles such as the Somme in World War I, the Russian territorial advance is literally slower than a snail's pace. A snail would move faster than some of these battles. Some of them, the slowest, say Chasiv Yar, were 15 meters per day. And this is at a time of 1,000 or 2,000 casualties per day. And a lot of the fighting, I want to note in the other map on the right, is in the northern part of that Donetsk region. Those 5 red territories are the provinces, let's say, that Russia has annexed and calls part of Russia. But the gray line above the red area are the areas that Russia doesn't currently control. So Russia annexed these territories. They don't actually control them. And what they've been trying to do for the last 4 years is to actually gain control, not only of those territories, but all of Ukraine. But even if you restrict it to just these annexed areas, you can see that Russia has been unable militarily to capture those territories. And that area in the northern part of Donetsk is where much of the fiercest fighting has occurred. And you can see that given the losses on both sides, but especially on the Ukrainian side, they're unwilling to give up territory to Russia in this peace process that they have literally been fighting over for the last 4 years. So it's kind of important to note how slow moving the war has been and how Russia hasn't been able to achieve militarily even limited gains that it's wanted to achieve. So I think that most analysts, when they look at 2025, they would say it hasn't been a good year for Russia, and virtually no one would say that at this point Russia is, quote, winning the war. Both sides are continuing to fight on, but it's hard to see a victory in sight at this point. Okay, so let me switch a little bit to like how the war on Ukraine has affected U.S. transatlantic relations. One of the big problems is that initially the US and NATO allies were united in their support for Ukraine and their willingness to try to help Ukraine stand up to Russia. In 2025 and 2026, there's been a bit of a break, not only in that policy, but there have been breaks in the transatlantic alliance more generally. Part of the break in NATO had to do with US criticism of NATO funding, NATO not paying its fair share. But I think something that's interesting is that European defense spending is up very significantly, especially in the last year. And the US has allowed Europe to continue to support Ukraine by buying US weapons. But at the same time, the United States has really embraced Putin literally in different ways, meeting with the summit in Alaska and by sending envoys that are much more sympathetic to Russia than to Ukraine. But also, the U.S. has embraced other anti-EU governments, such as Viktor Orban, there in the far corner. And probably the most important thing is that the U.S. threat towards Greenland, towards a NATO ally, has really caused a kind of an earthquake of distrust within the alliance. And I would say this level of discord between the US and NATO is an absolute gift to Putin. Even in his wildest dreams, he could never have imagined this level of discord between the US and NATO allies. In addition, the US put out a defense strategy, which is the U.S. National Defense Strategy is a document mandated by Congress every 4 years where the administration, and in particular the Department of Defense, Department of War, has to address strategic goals in the U.S. And what's notable in this document is much more of a focus on the U.S. homeland, Western Hemisphere, and to some extent China. But there's also very clear language that says NATO allies need to take the lead in Europe's defense and in Ukraine's defense. So it's not necessarily cutting Ukraine off, or it's not a full pullout of NATO by the US, but it's saying that the US has other priorities. On top of that defense strategy document, there was also a conference recently, the Munich Security Conference. This is a yearly conference for national security personnel from around the world where they discuss different things. It's held in Munich, so it has an obvious European focus. The document that the Munich Security Council put out was actually titled "Under Destruction." The world has entered a period of wrecking ball politics. That's a direct quote from their document. And there was a lot of tough sort of unfiltered discussion at this conference. German Chancellor Merz said directly the post-World War II US-led rules-based global order is over. And by that, he meant the focus on international institutions that have guided transatlantic relations, the belief that NATO and the US and Europe were working together to do things like support the principle of sovereignty and territorial integrity. He was saying those principles are under threat, and we have to think about a new European security architecture. The conference also brought up that there's a huge gap between concerns that the US has, namely criticizing European democracies, focusing on protecting European civilization, focusing on stopping immigration into Europe, versus what Europeans think is important, which is a threat from Russia and some of these principles of sovereignty and global international order. I think it's notable that Secretary of State Rubio, in his speech to the conference, even though he was a little bit more conciliatory than Vice President J.D. Vance last year, Secretary Rubio did not once mention Russia in his remarks. He did in a question that was asked to him, but it shows a difference in the U.S. and European priorities. And I think the takeaway for many people from the conference is that whether Europe is ready or not, they can no longer really rely on the United States for their security. Now, at this point, a lot of people would ask me, well, do you really think Russia is going to attack Europe? Is Russia really a threat to Europe? And what I want to note is that Russian hybrid warfare against Europe is already going on. This is a map put out by IISS, which shows hybrid attacks, which are a range of different things. So it could be damage to underwater infrastructure like the cables, cyber attacks, GPS jamming, disrupting satellite communications, sabotage, bombings, not to mention violations of airspace, as well as propaganda, disinformation, meddling in elections, etc. Now, there's a lot of discussion about what hybrid warfare is and how we can agree or not agree on definitions of it, but these attacks are going on. And so it's not a matter of would Russia do something to Europe? They're already doing things. And the question is, what is Europe going to do about it? And to what extent is the US going to help out? So this is my final slide. I just want to note that, as a Russia expert, I want to just emphasize this point that Russia's strategic interests are to weaken the United States and Europe, including international institutions such as NATO and the EU. So that is what Russia is up to. There's nobody really questions that. The question is, what is the United States going to do? Are we finished with threats to NATO countries? Are we past the Greenland episode and going to move on to a better relationship with our NATO allies? Are we going to continue to provide intelligence and sell weapons to Europe? So far, the U.S. has continued to do that, and that's vitally important, not only to Ukraine's security, but to European security. But we've also taken a much softer line towards Russia. Our envoy, Steve Witkoff, has visited Russia 7 times. He's not visited Ukraine once. He said he trusts Putin. And so we don't know to what extent the U.S. may shift to a much softer stance on Russia, including potentially getting rid of sanctions or things like that. But the U.S. Does not hold all the cards. Europe has the ability to build up their own military capabilities. And it's a question of whether they're going to actually do that. They understand it's necessary, but it's a matter of debate whether it's going to actually happen. There's discussion of new potential alliances within Europe, including bilateral groupings and new discussions over alternatives to the NATO nuclear umbrella. And last but not least, I just want to note that in 2026 and 2027, there are a number of elections in European capitals and European states, I should say, which could entail changes, and that could also affect the way that the EU and Europe works overall. So there's a lot of potential change, and this is sort of a important moment in world affairs, and 2026, we'll see what it brings. Thank you.
Thanks, Yoe. Great opening for us tonight. Lots to think about there. Saw some great questions and comments coming in already. But next, we're going to go straight to John Peavyhouse, who's going to talk a bit about the situation in the Middle East and also global trade relations. John, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me, as always. So I want to take a couple of the big geopolitical issues that are kind of in the headlines right now, ripped from the headlines, and talk about some of these larger questions that you posed at the beginning about national security strategy and general U.S. approach to foreign policy, and kind of use them to illustrate some of these issues. So let's start with Iran. Obviously, a lot of talk has been going on about Iran and President Trump's threat to strike Iran, either in a big way or a small way, based on the outcome of negotiations that are ongoing in Geneva right now with Iran over the future of their nuclear program. Now, to give a couple pieces of context and background here, this past summer, there was a war between Israel and Iran over Iran's nuclear program in an attempt to essentially destroy this Iranian nuclear program, which was assisted in June by the United States, where the United States dropped some significant tonnages of bombs on suspected Iranian and known Iranian nuclear sites. But that was kind of the limit of U.S. involvement at that point. There was a brief missile attack to respond to the U.S. Against Qatar. This was not a significant attack, both because it was small in nature and because the Iranians essentially told us it was coming. But then the second important piece of context is over this past winter, significant protests have broken out in Iran, the cause of which is the plunging Iranian currency, the rial. The rial is at its lowest point in its history against the dollar. The protests in Iran, in Tehran in particular, began December 28th in response to this currency crisis, and it broke out in several marketplaces around the city, and then this kind of spreads to other parts of the city, then other parts of the country. And by the end of December, the first week of January, there's thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of people protesting the Iranian government. This turns into hundreds of thousands when on January 13th, in the beginning stages of Iran cracking down on these protests, President Trump announces via his Truth Social account, help is on the way. Well, that help did not come in the immediate short term. That said, within a couple of days, Trump begins to make strong demands very openly and publicly that the Iran nuclear program must be eliminated or they will face attack. Now, this brings to light, I think, a lot of questions about the nature of the U.S. involvement in that first conflict, why the U.S. chose to stay out of the protest movement and not play a more direct military role there, and why now is there interest in another strike in taking out the nuclear program. So I want to talk about a couple of things. Number one, there is a large body of thought out there that suggests that this really all is a bluff, that this really is a negotiation tactic, that what Trump wants to do is get the Iranians to get rid of their nuclear program. And the way he believes this could happen is just like with Greenland, right? You rattle the saber enough and you'll get people to the table and get a deal to your liking. That is certainly one possibility. Well, I think we'll know more by the end of the week exactly what's going to happen. I think the second thing really reflects a broader geopolitical change and shift in strategy. For my 2 cents, I think one of the major things going on is that individuals in the administration and other Iran watchers in Washington believe that right now Iran is at a very critical point, and the leadership of the Islamic government is at a very critical point because of these protests. The protests there was clearly a very bloody crackdown in mid-January. The reports now coming out of Iran this last week are they're starting to reignite a bit. And I believe the hope of many is that even a limited strike on Iran over the nuclear program could sort of decapitate the leadership and begin a set of begin a revolution that would bring you a new government into power in Iran. And this is a vision of regime change, an idea of regime change that is somewhat different and unusual than we've seen, I think, since World War II. We saw this in Venezuela, right? When the Trump administration goes in, quickly pulls Nicolas Maduro out of the country and sort of leaves the remaining actors, there and sort of doing their thing. There's pressure, and there's open pressure and threats that if the next group of leaders act similarly, that will happen again. But this isn't the Iraq War. This isn't Afghanistan. There's no significant military presence that's left behind. In my view, this is kind of what I think the ideal Trump scenario is, right? There's a decapitation strike, there's a revolution in Iran, and we can all walk away. from this. That is a completely different view. It really abandons the old Colin Powell saying about the second Iraq war, right? That you break it, you buy it. That is not at all the mentality that appears to be kind of ruling the day in the Trump administration. There's a leader we don't like. We can take them out. We can try to diffuse the situation from the top. I think one of the big debates and one of the big constraints on this not having happened already are our allies in the Middle East. And what's interesting and different from what Yoey talked about with the tension between our allies in Europe and Ukraine, there's a very different dynamic with our allies in the Middle East, in part because some of our key allies there are not themselves that friendly with one another. And in particular, I think one of the things holding Trump back and one of the big debates that's happening among national security strategists right now and on the NSC is what happens the day after some kind of strike. Traditionally, I would say prior to 2 years ago, countries like Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Qatar, were very much for regime change in Iran. They saw Iran as a strategic threat in the region. They said Iran supports Hezbollah, Iran supports Hamas. Hamas and Hezbollah, among other groups, the Houthis in Yemen, were very actively kind of working against Saudi interests, Emirati interests, etc. So they would have loved to have seen Iran fall apart. But what's happened in the last 2.5 years is that Israel has essentially minimized Hamas through the Gaza war, and they've decapitated Hezbollah in Lebanon. Syria has a new leader where a lot of Iran's interests lay as well, he's not at all beholden to Iran. So now the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Qataris look around and they say, who is the new superpower in the region? And the answer is Israel. It's not Iran any longer. Iran has largely been neutered of a lot of its powers in that region. And given their weak and somewhat tepid response to the war from Israel over their nuclear program, what many believe is that there's a lot of concern in Arab capitals that Israel is now the major threat. And while none of them, I think, are worried that they're going to wake up tomorrow to an Israeli invasion, they are worried about the long-run balance of power consequences to Iran fading. Does this mean they like Iran? No. Does this mean they want a successful Iranian nuclear program? No. But it's become an important question. There was a report that came out today that the Saudis had given the green light to Trump to attack Iran. Don't know if that's exactly true or not, but the point is, the implication was they had not previously done so, right? That they were still on this position that we wanted to be careful about Iran. The concerns are both Israel, but it's also the potential crisis that could happen if the Iranian government falls and there's no clear successor that comes into power. First of all, I'd say there's no clear idea that any successor government to the Ayatollah would be pro-West, would be pro-Israel, would want to abandon the nuclear program. Bombs do not eliminate the knowledge of the nuclear scientists in Iran. So that remains, right, a long-run threat. I think the second issue is that Iran is a very large and multi-ethnic society. Only 60% of Iranians are Persian, right? The rest are Azeris, Balochs, Kurds, right? You name it. Iran has held this together with a pretty iron fist, this country together, through somewhat uses of force, right? If that breaks open, you have weapons flowing everywhere out of Iran. That leads to a disaster scenario, much like we saw with Iraq and Syria, the Kurds into Turkey with the 2003 Gulf War. You could see that scenario all playing out over and over again. So this is the balance that the U.S. is trying to strike. The U.S. wants to end the Iranian regime, frankly. We want to end the nuclear program. We want to help Israel achieve some of its goal to have Iran stop helping groups like Hezbollah. We're worried about the Iranian missile program, as is Israel, but we also want the Gulf states on board. And the Gulf states have been very clear they don't want to help us in the war. But the question is, will they give it a green light? And the reports are, as of this week, they are going to do so. So we will see. But again, I think that reflects kind of new ways of thinking about regime change and what responsibilities are for a country that tries to engineer regime change. Okay, shifting gears completely. The other headline that, again, I think really reflects on obviously a different strategy, which we've known for a while from the Trump administration, has to do with trade. On Friday, the Supreme Court struck down Trump's tariffs enacted through the IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, as an unconstitutional encroachment upon Congress's power to tax and regulate trade. Trump has announced in response to that he's replacing a 15% tariff across the board on all goods coming into the United States. He has authorized this under Section 122 of the 1974 Trade Act. The difference is that Section 122 tariffs can only last for 150 days unless Congress acts. The IEEPA tariffs, in theory, if they had been allowed to stand, could have gone on as long as Trump declared there was a national emergency. So these new tariffs have a couple issues. Number one, they're going to go away in 150 days. And number two, they're justified on the basis that there is a balance of payments problem within the United States. As Professor Knetter could tell you, another name for a trade deficit is a capital account surplus. We do not have a balance of payments problem. And many people have pointed this out in the last few days, suggesting that a lawsuit that would stop these tariffs should be pretty easy to file and win for any manufacturers that are still bothered and firms that are bothered by these tariffs. That said, what I believe is going to happen, and my prediction among other folks out there, is that he's going to use this 150 days, assuming the court won't make a decision in 150 days, to find other tools and ways to do this where he doesn't have to involve Congress. Options would be Section 301 or 232 of the Trade Act, which allows retaliatory tariffs for unfair trading practices. Traditionally, you have to get the U.S. Trade Representative Office or other parts of the bureaucracy to agree that different countries are trading unfairly. But given DOJ's actions and the reductions in force to much of the bureaucracy, including the trade bureaucracy, there are very few bureaucrats that are left in that part of the Trump administration that are not very loyal to Trump himself. So the odds are he could get some kind of findings. He could also use a national security exception. The problem with that, of course, is that a lot of the countries the U.S. has significant trade imbalances with, like Vietnam, this is because of things like textiles, not because of steel or things that could be painted as in the national security picture. So what happens now? Obviously, there'll be a rebate scramble. But I think the interesting big picture strategy implication here is that Trump has lost his leverage. Many folks viewed these tariffs really not as a way to bring back jobs, not as a way to raise money, although that was a nice side effect, but it was a way to get new tariff deals, get new trade deals with countries that would be more beneficial to the United States. So you slap a high tariff, you then bargain it away during the process. It's harder now to slap those high tariffs on, especially across the board tariffs on countries. So countries that already made a deal feel like they look a little silly now for having agreed to this already. And countries that haven't made a deal yet are going to dig in their heels. And they're going to wait for the next court decision, or they're going to wait for the next action by Congress, which could be, depending on the election outcomes this midterm, to try to further undo Trump's tariffs. So ultimately, this increases strain on the economy. It solves some of the uncertainty, probably for the next couple weeks. But it increases it in the medium term. And I think the other thing to realize is that the longer tariffs stay at any level, the longer tariffs stay on goods, the more it hurts consumers. If tariffs are a short-run policy, oftentimes companies will eat those tariffs, right? They'll not pass it on to the consumer. It's what economists call pass-through. But the longer those stay on, companies are just unwilling to do it. So especially on things like manufactured goods, those tariffs have not really kicked in for a lot of consumer side purchases. They're more likely to do so now the longer this drags on and the longer the uncertainty drags on. So again, how does this relate to the big national security strategy? Well, it's the America First spheres of influence strategy, right? We really only care about our sphere, what's been called the Don Roe doctrine, right? That we care about Latin America, we care about America First, we care about policies like immigration, we care less about Europe, we care less about China, we care less about Russia. One of the things that was absent from the new national security strategy that both Mike and Yoey have mentioned is any discussion of great power competition. It really reads as though we're returning to the turn of the 19th to 20th century ideas of spheres of influence. China has their sphere, Russia and Europe will have their sphere, the US will have our sphere. And this is kind of what I read as kind of the vision of this document. And the US withdraws back from that sphere. I think there might be some withdrawal, there might be some lessening of American resources going abroad that many people might agree to, a few might not. But I think one of the big challenges to this new strategy, I think, are twofold. Number one, we talked a lot about Iran. Who's the sphere of influence in Iran? Who is the great power who controls Iran? China wants nothing to do with it. Russia would like to do it if it can be cheap, but this leaves it for the United States or for Israel to be the great power. And you saw Ambassador Huckabee's comments earlier in the week to Tucker Carlson that Israel should just control most of the Middle East. This was not taken very seriously. This was certainly criticized heavily in Arab capitals. That's really not, I think, where Trump wants to go at all. But the point is, who is it, if not Israel? And this is exactly the kind of tensions that are brewing between Arab countries, Israel, and the United States as they think about Iran. I'd say the second problem is, does the U.S. need economically and politically, does the U.S. have everything it needs economically and politically in the sphere, in the Latin American sphere? Do we get everything we need from those trade relationships, from those political relationships? Obviously, the answer is no. The globalization toothpaste is out of the tube. It's hard to put back in. And so the idea that you can retract back to a narrow set of interests that are just geographically close by is a time that I think is well past the United States. And so how you then start drawing lines about what is influence, what is a sphere, what is not a sphere, I think becomes very difficult. And the NSS really did not say a whole lot about that. And it's been kind of difficult to tell so far what those spheres are, again, outside of Latin America and Greenland for the United States. So I'll stop there. Look forward to folks' questions, and thank you.
Thank you, John and Yoey. Wow, lots to think about tonight. We promised a great show, and we've got one. I'm just going to follow up on a couple of points that we didn't quite hit yet. You've done a great job kind of mentioning the Dunroe Doctrine and the focus on the Western Hemisphere. Certainly, what happened in Venezuela is consistent with that. We're seeing Mexico take action against the cartels, partly due to U.S. pressure. I think part of the objective with Venezuela is to put more pressure on Cuba. That all seems consistent with this new national security strategy. John pointed out, the Middle East situation. I don't quite know where that fits in. I don't know that that's our natural sphere of influence, but it is kind of a vacuum, as you point out. But what about our traditional allies or friends in Asia? How do they view our commitment to their region in light of the fact, obviously they're not in the Western Hemisphere and there is this great power, China? Are we just ceding that influence to China and we're checking out? Because there I don't really hear as much. We see a lot happening between the US and Europe and NATO. And it's clear we're kind of putting more pressure on Europe to stand up for themselves and maybe backing away from that. But what about Asia?
You want to start?
Well, I think they're concerned. I mean, if you're Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, you're very concerned. Russia and China, an interesting thing that's happening in the Ukraine war is there's kind of a cooperative agreement on weapons manufacturing and supply between China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. And meanwhile, talk of spheres of influence where Russia gets to do what it wants and the US is going to be in the Western Hemisphere. And even, I would say, some conciliatory language towards China in recent national security documents, I think would make people in Japan, South Korea, Taiwan really question the U.S. commitment to their defense. And they are certainly scrambling, thinking about options, thinking about what they maybe need to do in the absence of a secure U.S. commitment to their defense. And actually, John knows more about this, but I'll just note that it's been a consistent point by President Trump to criticize other countries' free riding on U.S. security. So that was a criticism of NATO, but it's also a criticism of Japan.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, if you go back to, you can find the 1985 New York Times editorial by New York business magnate Donald Trump criticizing U.S. foreign policy and criticizing Reagan for allowing Japan to free ride on the United States. And I think that's the only other thing I would add is, yes, the allies in Asia are nervous. You've also seen, though, shifts to a much more conservative leadership in some of these countries as well, Japan in particular. And what is one of the first things the new Japanese prime minister said? We need to be able to defend Taiwan, right? And that caused a huge row with China by Japan essentially saying, we need to think about being able to protect Taiwan. That was unimaginable, I think, a decade ago. that Japan would say that and that they would try to build the resources to do this, but also that kind of geostrategic, that regional linkage would be made. Last thing I'll say, there's a fascinating article today, either in the Wall Street Journal or CNBC, sort of talking about the fact that what no one's talking about is that if Taiwan is invaded, China takes over TSMC, and our AI industry falls completely flat, and it's done, right? Because all of those chips used in AI are all being manufactured in Taiwan. And if you think China's going to invade and keep sending those to us, you've got another thing coming.
My bet would be TSMC would be gone by the time they got there to take it. I do not think that will be handed over. I think that will be blown up before it's handed over. But
yes,
that's just my guess. So beyond the U.S., so how do you see, we've kind of moved from what was almost a unipolar world. I mean, the U.S. dominating over everyone. And I thought it was going to a bipolar world where there's this great power competition between the U.S. and China. And we have just bypassed that and now gone to this multipolar world, which I think is likely to be very chaotic and very expensive, because the number of people who will be engaged in military buildup is going to be extraordinary. And if you want to talk about an affordability crisis, watch out, because the pressure on raw materials and energy and everything else that goes into this will be extraordinary, in my opinion. But how do you see, Asia in particular? Will we see new alliances forming there to kind of be the bulwark versus China? Because can Japan really go it alone? Doesn't seem that way. Is Australia big enough to matter? I'm not sure.
I don't know. I mean, obviously the huge issue or country that could shift any of these balances is India. Mm-hmm. They are a nuclear power. They are large. They are strong. They have an incredibly inefficient economy, but they're obviously at play, and they have skirted this line between Russia and the United States. Trump heavily criticized India until a few weeks ago, and we finally got a trade deal with India. India has a large, very closed economy. So we'll see, whether India plays some kind of balancing role, or if they can tip the scale one way or the other. I think China traditionally has obviously heavily invested in the Belt and Road Initiative through Central Asia into Africa. Although an interesting factoid, over the last 3 years, the single largest investor in Africa is not China, it is the Emirates. Right, which is another fascinating trend that's starting, which is the Middle East countries are starting to invest heavily in Africa, and China is starting to leave that region a little bit. Final quick thought, Mike, the last time we had a bunch of great powers and spheres of influence was 1914. Didn't work out so well.
That's what I'm worried about, just the chaos that comes with a multipolar world. So, Yoey, we had a question come in early from the audience about, when do you think the Ukraine-Russia conflict will end? Do you have thoughts on that? I know we talked earlier before the show. A lot of military people expected it would be probably a year and a half, and this would just get settled. The lines would be clear, and we're just not there yet. And one audience member actually suggested, would there ever be some kind of international referendum and solution imposed by, I don't know what body now, the Board of Peace or the UN? I don't know who does that anymore, but just wondering your thoughts on how long it might go and how it could get settled.
Yeah, great questions. I think that one way to think about the war is the Russian war on Ukraine is there's actually an easy solution to this. And there's one answer, which is that the war is going to end when enough military leverage is put on Putin to force him to stop fighting. He's not going to voluntarily stop fighting. He's not in it for the money. He's not in it for a certain percentage of Ukrainian territory. So with all the peace deals that are floated and the different things, people worry about them being unfair to Ukraine, et cetera. But I think the thing you have to watch is, does Russia ever say, oh, that's what we want? Yes, we'll agree to that. No, they don't, because they actually don't want to stop fighting, and they think that they're winning. And as long as they think they're winning, they're going to keep fighting. So the war ends when there's enough military leverage put on Putin. And that might be when Europeans or the US or Ukrainians build up their weapon supplies enough, get enough manpower to actually put enough military pressure on Russia. But there's other things that are weakening Russia. The economy is weak. I saw that was one of the questions. So the economic troubles in Russia are real. It's making it difficult for Putin to recruit troops. That's for sure. But he has the will to keep fighting, even when many people are going to say the war is over. I was earlier thinking about what's a parallel. Is this like Germany 1943? But maybe it's like the Korean War, where the front line, the battle lines are kind of set, and the war just keeps going until what happens? Stalin dies, and you get a peace treaty. So I think that's one of the things that to understand is that Putin is not interested in stopping fighting. He's not interested in giving up. He's not interested in a deal. So that's going to be military pressure on him. That's going to bring about the end of the war.
And so that's an interesting comment. I want you to elaborate on what you mean by military pressure in the light of, we got a comment or question, from the perspective of Russian military doctrine. Aren't the losses so far in this war acceptable to Russia? And a viewer earlier, I also note, asked about what's included in casualties and how many casualties versus deaths. I think there were 1.2 million casualties and maybe 300,000 deaths, and casualties include the wounded and missing.
So casualties is deaths, wounded, missing, taken prisoner altogether. For deaths on the Russian side, I would say the range is around 400,000-ish, but it's moving up there. On the Ukrainian side, the overall casualties are probably closer to 400,000. So then if you take it's probably like 150-ish thousand in deaths, because yes. Ukrainians they're not as they care more about casualties, they care more about deaths. So yes, on the military doctrine side, or on Putin's side, like, the number of people dying is completely irrelevant. Like, not a single tear shed for anybody that's suffering in the war by Putin. So it's not that it's not that they say, like, well, there's a certain level of casualties, now we're going to stop. It's that they need to find new recruits to replace the people who are being killed or so critically injured that they can't return to battle. So the constraint is, how are they going to get people to be in the army? And they've tried different strategies. They've tried massive payments on the order of $30,000 to $40,000 when you have somebody making an average of $500 a month. So huge payments. They've tried taking people out of prison. They are currently suspending prosecution of people accused of murder or assault or things like that if they go fight on the front. They've tried kidnapping foreigners from Nepal, from African countries, from India. They've gotten 10,000 plus soldiers from North Korea. So they're looking for ways to get more soldiers, trying to entice people, trying to push it onto regional governors to meet quotas. But they're clearly having trouble meeting the quotas and having enough people to make up for the losses that they're suffering each month.
Yoa, you'd mentioned in your remarks some comments about the hybrid warfare that you think is going on, that Russia's initiating against Europe. Do either of you have thoughts about the extent to which Russia will interfere with the U.S. midterms, and how do you expect that would be done, if so?
I think the most straightforward thing is that Russia promotes disinformation 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, from 1 million bots or more. So, I mean, there is a constant disinformation campaign. Unfortunately, you see that sometimes picked up in U.S. media sites. There are even people in the administration who repeat some kinds of Russian propaganda points. So that's one thing. And Russia is always interested in sowing discord, chaos, etc. So that's one thing. But there's other suspicious things that have happened in Europe, like explosions at DHL warehouses, these undersea cables, the attacks on electrical infrastructure, on dams, on stuff like that. That, I think, is a little bit more unpredictable. But I think the most straightforward thing is the disinformation campaigns.
You agree, John?
Yeah. Nothing to add there. I think that's exactly right. Yeah. It is a constant, nonstop barrage. Yeah.
And hacking, like generally hacking, but that's not just Russia. It's like computer hacking happens all the time. It doesn't respect international boundaries or treaties.
Pakistan. Yeah.
So, John, for you, one viewer asked who really are our allies in the Middle East, obviously Israel, but if you could comment on who the other allies are when you mention U.S. allies in the Middle East. And then a follow-on, do you think Iran is actually serious about obtaining nuclear weapons and all the geopolitical baggage that would entail? The commenter remarks that it seems like they've been a week away from nukes for the last 30 years, which, I sort of feel the same way. So.
Sure. Right. Let me take the first one. Allies in the Middle East. I mean, practically, I would say almost every country in the Middle East is at least on paper a declared U.S. ally. Turkey is sort of a frenemy. The new Syrian regime has kind of kept us at a safe distance, but the U.S. has treated the new regime better than the last regime, the Assad regime. Lebanon we talked to, Lebanon's difficult because it's mostly run by Hezbollah, which of course we has classified as a terrorist organization, yet there's a civilian side in Lebanon that we would love to see kick Hezbollah out or keep minimize Hezbollah and its governance. Israel, Saudis, the Emirates, we have bases in Qatar, Kuwait, obviously, Iraq has a tenuous but friendly regime to the United States. So, Egypt, is friendly to the US too. So there are a lot of friends that we have in the Middle East. How much the U.S. would get from a national interest perspective out of these friends, I think, is questionable. Certainly, none of them are going to help us in a war against Iran. And in fact, some of them have already discussed like a lack of overflight, right? One of our aircraft carriers is sitting in the Mediterranean, and certain countries, Jordan, by the way, is also friendly, have said we can't attack Iran and fly over their airspace, much as what happened with Turkey in the Second Gulf War. And so, are they actively hostile? Are they working directly against U.S. interests? Not necessarily, but they're also not bending over backwards to help the United States. I think one thing that's been interesting is how the U.S. has, ironically under Trump, been very pro-Israel, but also pushed Israel in some ways that I think has made it somewhat uncomfortable. Yoey mentioned Witkoff as someone who really likes Putin. Ironically, most of the reports inside Washington is that Witkoff, even though he says great things about Netanyahu, is actually not a fan and has been very frustrated with some of the Israeli behaviors over the last year. And so, again, is this going to lead to some strategic break? Absolutely not. But sort of on the sidelines and these diplomatic sidelines, especially about Iran, I think there's a lot of frustration going around on all sides. For example, Israel really wants the U.S. to do something about Iran's missile program and their sponsoring of Hezbollah. I would be shocked if any deal made about Iran's nuclear program says anything about either of those two issues. So,
And from Sally Gans, is North Korea still considered to be a threat to security in Asia, a threat to South Korea? Are they a threat to us? And of course, we all know they sent troops to help Russia in their campaign in Ukraine. I haven't heard as much about North Korean troops lately. It sounded like it didn't go well for them, probably because it was hard to coordinate with the Russian troops. But any thoughts about North Korea's role in Ukraine and more broadly, just as a threat to the U.S. and our allies?
Well, one thing I want to note is that both North Korea and China have a lot of observers in Russia. So they might not necessarily be at the front line, but they are very close and they're watching what's going on. And actually, I mean, despite Russia not achieving some of its gains, like both Russia and Ukraine have innovated a huge amount in terms of drones, in terms of replenishing their military over these losses. So on the one hand, you might say, well, like, why would you want to learn from Russia? On the other hand, they're engaged in a lot of different aspects of combat and technological innovation. And China and North Korea are both really interested in that. North Korea is also providing a ton of artillery shells to Russia, and different kinds of munitions. So, I mean, I think from a certain perspective, you could say, like, hey, it's still a nuclear power that threatens the United States. It's absolutely anti-Western, and so it still is a threat to the U.S. And one might think that this cooperation between North Korea, Iran, China, and Russia is threatening to the U.S. But you're right that it doesn't seem to be at the top of this administration's list of things to work on.
I agree. And I would say, in part, answer to the previous question, which I missed. I mean, North Korea is a nuclear power, so it's always going to be somewhat on the radar. And this is why Iran, in theory, would want nuclear weapons. You're just treated differently when you have these, and you're given a level of respect and caution that you otherwise are not. A world where North Korea does not have nuclear weapons we would have far fewer qualms about being more aggressive with them, for sure. That said, I also think, look, Iran, I think, knows now, this is why I suspect there will be a deal. Iran knows now Israel will attack it the closer it gets, and the US will likely help. And so can Iran foresee a future where they are actually allowed to do this? It's hard to say. And what we still don't know about this summer's conflict was how badly it really did hurt their nuclear program, right? Remember, we were told it obliterated their program, yet now we find ourselves bargaining to get rid of it again. And so, whether the initial assessment that we didn't do much was right, or whether the later assessment that we got a lot of it was right, I have no idea. But if Iran's going to do this, it's going to have to be in a very, very secret program.
The beatings will continue until morale improves.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I guess. Yeah. I want to thank you both. I know you're keen observers of politics. I know we're coming right up on the State of the Union address tonight, which will be on in a couple minutes. So I just want to thank you for joining us tonight. What a great, thought-provoking program. No surprise. We'll have you back again, because I'm sure we're going to have a lot to follow up on. There's a lot of hot spots in the world today. So thank you both very much. And thank our audience. Great engagement tonight. Great questions. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you back again next month, and on Wisconsin.